My name is Callie. I'm 42 years old, an active duty military officer. 300 days. That's how long I gritted my teeth, passed up deployments, and stayed up all night cleaning up battlefields of blood and vomit for my husband as cancer tore him apart. For those 300 days, his family, the self-proclaimed elites, never stepped foot inside the hospital. They complained about the smell of antiseptic. But today, with Frank in the ground for less than a year, my mother-in-law sent me a subpoena. She's suing to steal our house. Her reason: she accused me of being a cold-blooded government-paid soldier, using my deployments as an excuse to leave her son to die so I could manipulate his assets. She thinks money can crush a broke widow. But she doesn't know what the uniform hanging in my closet represents. Before I tell you the rest, let me know what time you're listening to this story and leave a like so we know none of us have to endure this injustice alone. Hit the subscribe button right now if you've ever had your life drained by so-called family, only for them to stab you in the back when you were at your weakest. I stood planted in the kitchen. Steam from the boiling chicken noodle soup fogged the glass pane overlooking Smith Mountain Lake. The subpoena laid flat on the cold granite island, crisp, heavy. My hands, the same hands that diffused explosives in the desert, went numb. My eyes locked onto the bold ink. Petition for recovery of assets. Undue influence. I didn't scream. The only sound was the cold November rain beating a drum against the tin roof. By the door, my muddy combat boots sat piled on the rug. Those boots stomped through sand to protect this country, but right now they couldn't even protect my front porch. My service weapon was locked in the safe. It didn't matter. The enemy just fired a shot right into my kitchen. I turned away from the smell of garlic and walked to the living room. The oak floorboards still bore deep scratches, the exact spot where Frank's hospital bed sat for 10 agonizing months. I spent 300 nights on my knees right there. I remembered the sting of bleach, the smell of bile, the way I'd soak a washcloth in warm water to scrub the sweat off his back when the bone-deep pain hit. Evelyn wasn't here. She was miles away in her riverside mansion with the heated floors swirling dark red wine, pinching her nose shut so she wouldn't have to smell the decay of her own son. Now she was using a $500 an hour lawyer to rewrite history and wipe those days from reality. I walked back and grabbed the document. I folded the thick paper in half. The sharp edge sliced right into my thumb. A bead of red blood bubbled up. The sting grounded me. Military conditioning snapped the locks on my brain. Compartmentalize. I stopped looking at that paper as a family tragedy. I looked at it as a hostile terrain map. I cracked open my laptop. The blue light washed over my face. I pulled up the state court system database and punched in the case number. Filed, Friday, 8:02 a.m. A dry breath escaped my lips. The classic Friday dump. They dropped the bomb right before the weekend so I couldn't retain counsel. A standard cowardly white-collar ambush. Then my phone screen lit up. A text message from Evelyn. The family needs to talk. Sunday dinner at my house. Don't make this ugly. I stared at the glowing letters. That wasn't an invitation. That was an enemy checkpoint. She was calling me in to demand my surrender before we even reached the battlefield. They wanted to see me shake. I walked back to the stove and twisted the burner off, grabbed the pot of lukewarm soup and dumped it straight down the sink drain. I pumped coarse soap into my palms, scrubbing the grease and the blood from my paper cut until my knuckles turned raw. I dried my hands, picked up the phone, and typed one word. Fine. The small family estate sat on the edge of the Elizabeth River. When the heavy mahogany doors groaned open, the smell hit me first. Expensive French perfume mixed with the rich, heavy scent of a slow-roasted beef tenderloin. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. My brother-in-law Richard and his wife Sandra were already backed deep into an oversized Italian leather sofa. Neither stood up. Neither offered a greeting. They just watched me with cold, calculating eyes. I swept my gaze across the room, mapping out the exits by habit. The dining table was set for 5. Fine china and polished silverware gleamed under the heavy glare of a gold chandelier. Then I noticed it. Frank's usual chair was gone. Removed entirely. It was as if he had never existed. Evelyn stepped out from the kitchen. Her silk apron lacked a single speck of grease. She looked at me, her eyes tracking down to my feet. "Come in, Callie," she said, her voice dripping with artificial politeness. "Take off those ugly shoes before you step on my rug." I unlaced my boots, stepped onto the hardwood, and took my seat. Dinner began in a calculated silence. The only sound was the sharp metallic scrape of silver knives slicing flesh. Evelyn cut the roast beef with slow precision. She slid the smallest portion onto a plate and pushed it toward me. "I assume a government paycheck doesn't buy much meat these days," Evelyn murmured, swirling a glass of dark red wine that looked exactly like pooled blood. "Eat up." Richard let out a low sneer, adjusting his watch. "The lawyer tells us the lake house could pull 600,000. That is an astronomical amount of money for a common soldier, isn't it?" They were appraising the roof over my daughter's head, putting a price tag on the very rooms where Frank took his final breaths. They were chewing and swallowing his life right in front of me. I gripped my silver fork. My knuckles turned stark white under the skin. I didn't say a word. Evelyn set her wine glass down. She dabbed the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin. "Listen to me, Callie," she said, dropping into that motherly tone she used right before ruining someone. "Sign the waiver. Give up the claim to the estate. You do not belong in this world. That uniform makes you nothing more than a hired hand for the government. You used your military duties to avoid taking care of my son while he was dying. Return the house to the family, and I will write you a check right now to start over." She slid a blank check across the white tablecloth. The absolute arrogance of people who believed every conscience had a price. I didn't look down. I kept my eyes locked directly into Evelyn's sockets. Seeing how these people treat a grieving widow makes my blood boil. If you believe no one should face this kind of wealthy cruelty alone, please support the channel by hitting the like button and subscribing right now. Drop a comment below with the word "steal" if you want to stand with me and see justice served. Slowly, I set my fork down onto the porcelain plate. A sharp, freezing click echoed through the room, cutting through their smug satisfaction. I stood up, pulling my shoulders back into a rigid military posture. I smoothed the fabric of my jacket straight. No tears, no screaming. Frank knew the value of blood and sacrifice. I said, my voice flat. "You only know the value of numbers." I turned toward the doors. Before my fingers wrapped around the brass handle, I stopped and looked over my shoulder. "I will see you in court, Evelyn." The door slammed shut. The cold November air hit my lungs. I drove through the dark, the engine roaring against the silence of the highway. When I unlocked my front door, the house was empty. I walked straight into the bedroom, dropped to my knees, and hauled out a heavy green metal lockbox from under the bed. My fingers spun the combination lock 3 times until it clicked. I grabbed the zipper. That night, I pulled into the driveway at exactly 10. The house was swallowed by darkness. No lights in the windows, no warmth left in the air. I walked inside the floorboards, groaning under my boots, and went straight to the bedroom. I dropped to my knees on the cold floor and hauled out the heavy metal lockbox from under the bed. Olive drab steel. A thin layer of dust coated the top, sticking to my skin as I wiped it away. I grabbed the combination dial, spun it 3 times, right twice, left, then hard back to 0. 3 dry, sharp metallic clicks cut through the silence. I popped the heavy latches and threw back the lid. No silk dresses inside, no shiny civilian medals. Just a thick stack of manila case files bound by heavy black rubber bands, a gleaming silver eagle insignia, and a laminated credential card. The bold black letters stamped across the top read, "Senior Trial Counsel, Judge Advocate General's Corps, United States Army." They wanted a legal war. They wanted to use $500 an hour suits to bury a broke widow. They forgot one minor detail. For 20 long years, I made my living stripping stars off crooked generals and throwing them into federal penitentiaries. I carried the files to the kitchen and yanked down the framed corkboard by the pantry. I cleared it off, throwing old grocery lists into the trash. Using rusted thumbtacks, I pinned Evelyn's subpoena right in the dead center. I pulled a thick red permanent marker from the drawer. I did not hesitate. I dragged the red ink across the legal paper, circling every lie they filed. Continuous absence from the home. Circle. Deliberate isolation of the patient. Circle. Fraudulent manipulation of separate property. Circle. I did not need to empty my savings to hire a high-priced firm. I was going into that courtroom under pro-se legal representation. I was going to use their own paperwork to cut their legal throats. I walked back to the bedroom and reached deep into the bottom of the olive drab box. My fingers brushed against a smaller container. Frank's old cedar wood box. The moment the rough wood touched my palms, my steady grip cracked. My hands, which remained perfectly still while marking target coordinates in war zones, started to shake. Looking at that wood meant facing him again. I gritted my teeth and shoved the lid open. The sharp, clean smell of cedar hit me instantly, mixed with the stale, faint aroma of loose tobacco. Inside lay his leather-bound journal, a stack of medical receipts showing my signature on every payment line, and a thick manila envelope sealed with a heavy dab of red wax. My eyes locked onto the front of the envelope. Frank's handwriting. The ink was uneven, the letters jagged and trembling from the heavy pain medication that made his fingers stumble across the page. The words read, "For Callie. When my mother does her worst." My chest tightened so hard I could barely draw breath. Even when his body was breaking down, he was still trying to build a fortress to keep me safe. He knew exactly who his mother was. I slid my thumb under the flap and tore the thick paper open. Inside lay a single legal document bearing a bright blue state notary stamp and a tiny black USB drive. I did not waste a second. I marched back to the kitchen, flipped open my laptop, and shoved the drive into the port. A single audio file popped up. The metadata showed the recording date July 12th. Exactly 4 months before Frank took his last breath. I untangled my black headphones, plugged them in, and slipped the buds into my ears. I pulled a freezing breath deep into my lungs, steadying my heart rate. Then, I clicked play. The low, scratchy audio hissed through the wires, dragging a voice from the dead straight into my eardrums. My eyes flew wide open. The plastic mouse groaned beneath the crushing, violent force of my grip. They had just dug their own graves. 5 o'clock in the morning. My eyes snapped open in the dark, a full 10 minutes before the alarm clock could even ring. I sat up. My right shoulder joint popped with a loud grinding crack in the silent room. It was a permanent souvenir from an IED blast back in Fallujah. I ignored the pain. I walked into the bathroom and twisted the shower handle all the way to the cold side. I stood under the freezing water, letting it hit my skin like ice needles. It killed off any lingering trace of grief. I dried off in silence. I pulled on a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit and buttoned my crisp white shirt all the way to the top collar. I pulled my hair back, tying it into a tight, hard knot at the base of my neck. Not a single loose strand. When I walked out of my front door into the freezing air, I did not bring a single drop of weakness with me. My body was completely locked into combat mode. The county courthouse lobby smelled heavily of industrial floor wax and stale coffee. Anna stood tight against my side. Her small hands gripped the hem of my suit jacket in a white-knuckled fist. She was only 14 years old. I could hear her ragged, shallow breathing. Her wide eyes stared down the long marble hallway in pure panic. Evelyn stood at the far end. She wore a heavy black cashmere coat flanked by 3 men in $1,000 suits. They carried massive alligator skin briefcases. They stood together laughing quietly, looking exactly like a pack of wolves circling a trapped animal. I placed my heavy calloused hand flat on Anna's shoulder and squeezed tight. "What did your dad hate the most?" I asked, keeping my voice low and perfectly steady. Anna looked up at me. She swallowed hard. "People who use money to bully others," she whispered. "Exactly," I said. "So stand up straight." The sharp, hard clack of designer high heels echoed against the marble floor. Evelyn marched straight toward us, leading her pack of lawyers. Her cold eyes swept over my empty hands. I did not carry a single briefcase. I did not bring a single paralegal. The corner of her mouth twitched upward into a cruel, condescending smirk. "You really should have taken that blank check and walked away, Callie," she sneered, stopping just a few feet from us. "Your little military arrogance will not help you win a real war in here." I stood perfectly still. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I did not offer her a single syllable in response. Instead, I used a technique we learned overseas, the 1,000-yard stare. I looked straight through the center of her head, completely stripping away her existence. She was not a threat. She was just an obstacle in the dirt. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom finally swung open. Everyone filed inside. On the plaintiff's side of the aisle, Evelyn's three lawyers spread out like an invading force. They completely covered their long oak table with stacks of legal documents, thick white binders, and silver laptops. Smug whispers bounced back and forth between them. On the defendant's side, I sat entirely alone. The massive wooden table in front of me was completely empty, except for one yellow legal pad and a cheap plastic ballpoint pen. Suddenly, the heavy door behind the high bench opened. A sharp crack of the wooden gavel silenced the entire room. Judge Harold Bennett walked in. He moved with the stiff, unmistakable posture of an old combat veteran. His eyes sharp as razor blades swept across the crowded plaintiff table, taking in the display of wealth. Then his gaze tracked over to the empty defendant table. He looked at my rigid squared shoulders. His eyes locked directly onto mine, and he stopped dead in his tracks. Evelyn's lead attorney stood up to deliver the opening statement. He smoothed down the lapels of his expensive custom suit, cleared his throat, and looked directly at the gallery. His voice boomed across the courtroom. "Your Honor, my client is a grieving mother," the attorney said, gesturing with a manicured hand toward Evelyn. She had to stand by and watch her dying son get manipulated by a heartless wife. We are dealing with an active-duty soldier who was continuously absent from the home. A woman who used the convenient excuse of military deployments to abandon her husband on his cancer bed. She left him to wither away in isolation, only to return at the final hour to strip away his assets using a forced, fraudulent power of attorney. He paused, directing a look of absolute disgust straight at my face. The entire room went dead silent. The court reporter stopped typing. I could feel the heavy gaze of every spectator pressing into the back of my neck. They were all waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the broke widow to burst into tears. I did not flinch. I did not blink. Judge Harold Bennett did not look at the slick attorney. He did not look at the thick binders piled on the plaintiff table. Instead, the old judge leaned his heavy forearms flat against the wooden dais. His sharp, weathered eyes bypassed the lawyers entirely and locked onto my position. He studied the way my spine formed a perfectly straight line against the back of the oak chair. He noted my hands flat and motionless on top of my thighs. He recognized that posture. He knew the discipline required to keep a body that's still under fire. "Mrs. Small," Judge Bennett said. His voice was heavy, carrying the rough edge of a man who spent his youth yelling over the roar of helicopter rotors. "I see that you do not have legal counsel present today. Are you intending to enter this record under pro se representation? Will you be representing yourself?" I stood up. I moved with deliberate precision. The heels of my boots snapped together against the floor with a sharp, dry report that sounded like a pistol shot. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. 3 words. Flat. Freezing. Evelyn let out a low, mocking scoff from her seat, but her smug satisfaction died in an instant. Judge Bennett slowly removed his reading glasses and set them down flat on his legal pad. He nodded once, a heavy, respectful tilt of his head. Then he looked straight into my eyes and spoke clearly into his microphone. "Good morning, Lieutenant Colonel." The words dropped into the room like a live flashbang. The air was instantly sucked out of the space. Total psychological paralysis. The lead attorney stiffened. His gold-plated fountain pen slipped from his sweating fingers. It hit the oak table with a loud clattering racket before rolling off onto the floorboards. The noise tore through the silence. Evelyn's mouth fell open. The thick layer of expensive beige powder on her cheeks seemed to crack open like dry mud. "Lieutenant Colonel," Evelyn spit out, her voice rising into a sharp, ragged hiss. The attorney scrambled his face, turning a dark red. He stammered, looking back and forth between the bench and my empty table. "Your Honor, the plaintiff was not made aware. We did not know Mrs. Small possessed the proper legal standing to." "Then you performed a severe disservice to your client," Judge Bennett cut him off, his voice dropping into a freezing growl. Lieutenant Colonel Callie Small is a senior trial counsel on active duty with the Judge Advocate General's Corps of the United States Army. Behind Evelyn, one of her young paralegals took a physical step backward. The white-collar corporate lawyers knew exactly what a JAG prosecutor meant. They were looking at a human meat grinder. Evelyn slowly turned her head toward me, her eyes wide with a sudden primal terror. I did not sit down. I crossed my arms over my chest, standing perfectly straight in my charcoal suit, looking down at her shrinking frame. The command of the room had just changed hands. The lead attorney swallowed hard, struggling to regain his composure. He gripped the edge of his mahogany table, clinging to his old tactical line. Your impressive military title does not alter the facts, Lieutenant Colonel Ayist you. The attorney said, his voice rising to fill the quiet room. My client maintains that you were continuously absent from the home. You used government orders as a shield to abandon a dying man on his sickbed. The blood in my veins went cold. The instincts of a senior trial counsel took over. I did not scream. I did not offer an explanation to defend my honor. I stepped away from my empty table and walked straight into the well of the court. I stopped right in front of the witness box. My gaze locked onto his sweating forehead. You accuse me of isolating my husband, I said. My voice was flat, carrying the low vibration of a chainsaw blade idling in the dark. Did you personally interview the specialized hospice nurse? The attorney blinked repeatedly. He darted his eyes toward Evelyn. No, he muttered. I took one deliberate step closer. Did you cross-reference the hospital visitation logs with my military deployment schedule? He pulled a linen handkerchief from his pocket, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. I did not. I locked my eyes directly onto his pupils. Did you speak to my husband's primary oncologist regarding who exactly stayed awake for 300 consecutive nights to clean his blood and bile? His throat convulsed. No, but my client... I raised my right hand palm flat, a single rigid gesture that instantly cut the air from his lungs. You have no data, I said, my voice cutting through his defense like broken glass. Your argument is garbage. The attorney stumbled backward. His hip hit the sharp edge of the plaintiff table with a dull thud. Thick white binders rattled against the wood. I turned my back on him and walked back to my table. I flipped open my legal pad and pulled out a single sheet of heavy paper bearing a bright crimson stamp. The defense submits Exhibit D to the record, Your Honor, I announced. The bailiff stepped forward, took the document, and handed it to Judge Bennett. The old judge adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the lines. A slow, grim nod touched his weathered face. Evelyn's attorney lunged forward, snatching his copy from the clerk. His manicured fingers shook so violently, the paper rattled. Where exactly did you obtain this power of attorney? The lawyer shouted, his professional mask tearing open. My client has never seen this document. I looked straight past him, pinning Evelyn to her chair. My voice dropped into an absolute freeze. From my husband, 8 months before he passed away. Judge Bennett cleared his throat, reading Frank's handwritten words into the official record. I make this decision to entrust all my separate property to my wife, Callie Small. This action is completely voluntary. Any future attempt by my family to dispute her ownership is a direct violation of my wishes. Listening to my husband's final words protect me from his own family tears, my heart wide open. These greedy vultures thought they could leave a broke widow with nothing. They did not count on the truth. If you stand with me against this wealthy cruelty, please support this channel by smashing the like button and subscribing right now. Drop a comment below with the word truth to show these people that justice cannot be bought. The notarized state seal on the paper demolished their entire lawsuit. Evelyn's face turned an ash gray. She violently ripped her silk handkerchief in half, her fingers clawing at the fabric. It was forced, Evelyn shrieked, her voice cracking into a jagged scream. He was out of his mind. He wrote that while he was delirious on heavy pain medication. She threw the torn silk onto the floorboards, stripping away all her fake elegance. I did not answer her. I slowly slid my right hand deep into my suit pocket, my fingers wrapping around the cold, rigid edges of the small black USB drive. It was time to drop the napalm. You claim he was forced, I said, my voice cutting through her, screeching like a razor blade. I stepped forward into the well of the court, my shoes hitting the floorboards with measured, heavy thuds. I placed the tiny black USB drive flat onto the court clerk's desk. The defense submits Exhibit F. This is an audio recording of a conversation between Frank Small and the plaintiff Evelyn Small inside hospital room 402. The date was November 12th, exactly 4 months before he passed away. Evelyn's lead attorney lunged forward. His face turned an unhealthy shade of purple as he opened his mouth to object. Judge Bennett did not let him speak. The old judge raised a single hand, cutting the lawyer off in mid-breath, and signaled for the clerk to plug the plastic drive into the computer system. A sharp, digital chime echoed off the high ceilings. Then a low, scratchy layer of electronic static hiss filled the quiet courtroom. I closed my eyes tight. I held my breath, gripping the edge of the wooden defense table until my knuckles went completely white. Evelyn's piercing voice exploded out of the wall speakers, instantly filling the space. "Sign the paper, Frank," her recorded voice demanded. Completely stripped of her upper-class elegance, it was raw, greedy, and venomous. "If that soldier wife of yours actually loved you, she would have returned the lake house to the small family by now. She abandoned you on this bed to chase government paychecks. Are you completely blind?" An agonizing sound followed. It was the wet, ragged sound of a violent coughing fit. Then came Frank's voice. It was a hollow wheeze, drowning in fluid and pain. "Mother, please stop," Frank whispered through the speakers, his voice cracking with pure exhaustion. "Callie has been awake for 3 consecutive days cleaning my room. She just closed her eyes. Please, leave us alone. It hurts too much." A dead, freezing silence choked the entire courtroom. Nobody moved. The court reporter sat completely frozen, her fingers hovering over the keys. Hearing his voice drag itself out from the graveyard ripped my chest completely open. A physical bullet leaves a purple bruise, but this sound was a rusted saw blade slicing straight through my soul. I shoved the agony down into a dark corner of my mind and opened my eyes. Evelyn had collapsed backward into her cushioned chair. Her expensive coat seemed to swallow her shrinking frame. The heavy makeup on her face could not hide the truth anymore. Her skin had turned a sickening mottled gray, sagging until she looked exactly like a dry, rotten apple. At her side, her corporate attorney frantically swept his thick white binders and silver laptops into his alligator skin briefcase. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely snap the brass latches shut. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at his client. They looked exactly like sewer rats scrambling to flee a sinking ship. Their $1 million facade was entirely crushed. Judge Harold Bennett raised his arm and slammed his heavy wooden gavel down onto the bench. The sharp report cracked through the room like a 12-gauge shotgun blast. "Mrs. Small," Judge Bennett growled, pointing a thick finger directly at Evelyn's trembling form. "You slandered an active-duty military officer in a court of law. Worse, you mentally abused your own biological son while he was helpless on his deathbed. There is more than enough evidence here for me to refer this file straight to the prosecutor's office for criminal fraud and elder abuse charges." The entire room stopped breathing. The air turned to pure ice. Every head in the gallery turned slowly toward my table. The judge stopped talking, his eyes locking onto my face. Evelyn was staring at me in absolute terror, her mouth working silently like a fish, gasping in the dirt. I stood perfectly straight, my arms crossed over my chest. I held the kill switch to her life right in my hand. The suffocating silence stretched across the courtroom like ice over a pond. Judge Harold Bennett kept his eyes fixed on my face, waiting for my signal. He held the power to destroy her, but he was leaving the final strike to me. I stood straight, my shoulders squared. I looked at Evelyn. She looked like a hollow shell, her elegant posture gone. "Your Honor," I said, my voice perfectly flat, devoid of anger or triumph. My objective from the moment I received that subpoena was to protect the dying wishes of my husband. I have accomplished that mission. I have no intention of pressing criminal charges against a 70-year-old woman. Judge Bennett stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He nodded slowly. He was an old combat veteran. He understood the rules of engagement. A real soldier does not fire upon an enemy who has dropped their weapon. He picked up his wooden gavel and brought it down one final time. The sharp crack signaled the end of the war. "The court dismisses the plaintiff's petition with prejudice," Judge Bennett announced through the microphone. "Absolute ownership of the property remains solely with Lieutenant Colonel Callie Small. This matter is closed." I did not listen to the murmurs in the gallery. I slowly picked up my pen and placed it inside my pocket. I closed my legal pad, folding it over with deliberate precision. I walked out of the courtroom. When the heavy glass doors of the county courthouse swung open, the cold November wind hit my face. It was freezing, but it smelled entirely clean. The crisp autumn air rushed into my lungs. Anna came sprinting across the concrete terrace, her small arms wrapped around my waist, her face buried into my charcoal jacket. She was sobbing, her shoulders shaking with a massive release of terror. "You won, Mom!" she cried against my chest. I placed my hand on her hair, gripping her shoulder. I looked out at the gray, overcast sky. "No, Anna," I whispered, my voice steady. "Your dad won." Across the wide stone stairs, the grim reality of a tactical defeat was playing out. The corporate lawyers frantically loaded their briefcases into a black car, ignoring their client. Richard and Sandra walked quickly down the opposite side of the steps, eyes fixed on the ground, avoiding the woman who paid their bills. Evelyn stood entirely alone on the freezing pavement. The bitter wind whipped the hem of her expensive black cashmere coat against her thin legs. She looked like an old woman who realized she had no cards left to play. I told Anna to wait inside our SUV. I watched her walk away until she was safe. Then I turned my boots toward the stairs. I walked down the steps, my heels tapping a slow rhythm against the concrete. I stopped exactly 1 meter away from Evelyn. No hatred, no anger, just the freezing stillness of a winter lake. She turned her sunken eyes up toward my face. Her lips trembled violently in the cold air. "You had the evidence," Evelyn whispered, her voice ragged. "You could have put me behind iron bars. Why did you stop?" I looked at the woman who tried to erase my 300 nights of sacrifice. My military discipline taught me how to pull a trigger, but my honor taught me exactly when to stop. "Because iron bars only change behavior," I said, speaking slowly, letting every word carry its full weight. "Tolerance reveals character." She blinked, her pale face tightening. "You spent your life using money to manipulate people," I said, my voice cutting through the traffic noise. "And today you lost the only thing that actually matters. From this day forward, you do not have a son. You do not have a family. You have absolutely nothing. Enjoy the rest of your life with that truth." I turned my back on her. My boots hit the pavement in a steady cadence as I walked away toward my car. I did not look back. That sentence was a permanent cage of her own making. 1 week after the trial, I took a leave of absence and drove down to the house by Smith Mountain Lake. The silence inside the rooms was heavy. I did not sit on the porch and weep. Instead, I pulled on my faded denim overalls, grabbed my heavy orbital sander, and went down to the water. I knelt on the rough planks of the wooden dock, firing up the machine. The violent whine of the motor roared across the water, drowning out the quiet lapping of the lake. I pressed the abrasive spinning pad hard against the peeling gray paint. White dust exploded into the cold air, stinging my eyes. Physical labor was the only medicine that could ground my mind. I scraped a thick layer of orange rust off the iron handrails, peeling it away down to the bare, unyielding metal. It was exactly what I was doing to my life, scraping away fake expectations regarding the so-called family blood ties of the small name. My phone buzzed, an unknown number from the Richmond area. I switched off the sander, letting the sudden silence rush back into my ears. I answered without a greeting. A ragged, hollow cough came through the speaker. Then came Evelyn's voice. It was thin, shaking, and completely stripped of the arrogant power she held a week ago. She asked to meet me. She named a greasy highway diner off Route 29 miles away from her massive riverside mansion. I did not say no. I did not want to make peace. I simply needed to put a permanent concrete block over this grave. I marched to the sink. I pumped industrial pumice soap into my palms, scrubbing my skin until the rough lather turned my knuckles raw. It washed away the grease, the rust, and the white paint dust. I pulled on my green military field jacket, grabbed my keys, and started the engine of my SUV. The highway diner smelled heavily of burnt black coffee and old grease from fried donuts. Evelyn sat wrapped in a corner booth, hidden in the shadows. The diamond necklaces were gone. The expensive cashmere coat was missing. She was just an exhausted woman with deep purple bags under her hollow eyes. Her liver-spotted hands trembled violently as she gripped a thick porcelain mug filled with plain hot water. She did not look up when I slid into the plastic booth across from her. "I was afraid," she whispered into the steam, her voice cracking like dry leaves. "Frank chose you. The moment he married you, he entered your world of military discipline. He completely left my control. I was jealous. I truly believed that if I stripped away the lake house, if I left you with absolutely nothing, I would somehow force his memory back into my hands." I slowly stirred my cup of bitter black coffee with a cheap metal spoon. A rhythmic metallic clink echoed against the thick ceramic wall of the mug. Her confession did not bring me a single ounce of satisfaction. It only brought a cold sense of pity for the sheer smallness of her soul. Narcissists always shatter the lives of everyone around them simply to patch the leaking holes of their own pathetic insecurities. "I loved him too, Evelyn," I said, my voice dropping into a low, quiet register that cut through the noise of the diner kitchen. "But I chose to set him free. You chose to suffocate him until he bled. This war is finished." I stopped stirring. I placed the spoon flat onto the napkin. "Never contact me again," I said, looking straight into her trembling eyelids. "And stay away from Anna." I stood up straight, pulling my field jacket tight. I dropped a single $5 bill flat onto the scratched Formica table. I walked toward the glass doors, my boots hitting a steady, heavy beat against the floor. I did not look back at the shadow in the booth. It was Christmas Eve. Thick white snow covered the rough wooden planks of the dock I repaired last week. Inside the house, the living room fireplace crackled and popped, throwing warm orange light across the cold hardwood floor. The scent of burning pine filled the room. I reached deep into the pocket of my heavy wool coat. My fingers brushed against a thick, textured envelope. It arrived 3 days ago. A handwritten card from Judge Harold Bennett. I pulled out the heavy paper. The black ink was dark and pressed deep into the grain. "Some men spend their entire lives expanding their power," the old combat veteran wrote. "Very few learn how to hide their weakness to protect what is most sacred." I folded the card slowly. I walked over to the stone mantelpiece and placed it right next to Frank's framed photograph. A silent salute from one soldier to another. My husband was finally at peace. Heavy, rapid footsteps hammered against the hallway floorboards. Caleb, the 8-year-old son of my old platoon sergeant, sprinted into the living room. He stopped dead in his tracks. A dull silver chain hung around his neck. My old metal dog tags dangled against his small chest, clinking softly as he breathed. He found them in the hall drawer. His wide eyes stared up at my face. "Aunt Callie, are you like the cool soldiers in the movies?" Caleb asked, his voice breathless with excitement. "Did you defeat the bad guys?" A sudden heavy sound pushed its way up my throat. A real deep laugh. The first genuine laugh I produced in 8 long months. I knelt on the hardwood floor. I reached out my calloused fingers, smoothing the cold metal tags flat against his cotton shirt. The raised letters of my blood type and serial number pressed into my thumb. "No, Caleb," I said quietly. "I just did my duty." I stood up and walked toward the back door. I pushed the heavy glass open and stepped out onto the porch. The freezing December wind hit my face like a physical blow, but I did not flinch. Smith Mountain Lake was half frozen. A thick sheet of white ice stretched across the dark water, reflecting the cold, sharp silver light of the winter moon. The trees surrounding the property stood tall and silent, guarding the perimeter. No more legal subpoenas waiting in the metal mailbox. No more hostile dinners filled with the suffocating stench of silent contempt. No more wealthy, greedy vultures hiding behind the sacred word of family just to set their miserable traps. This structure of wood and stone was finally restored to its original purpose. It was no longer a battlefield. It was a permanent, quiet stronghold. The campaign was completely over. I secured the objective. I closed my eyes. I pulled a long, freezing breath of winter air deep into my lungs. My chest expanded, filling with pure, unyielding life. The deep wounds of betrayal do not simply vanish. They harden over time. They turn into thick, permanent scars. And those scars eventually become your armor. A soldier can survive the brutal, deafening crossfire of an active combat zone in a foreign desert. only to be heavily wounded by a rusted knife to the back from their own rear guard. The deepest, most fatal cuts always come from the exact people who claim the title of family. They exploit your grief. They use your blind loyalty as a weapon against you to feed their own bottomless greed. But the iron in your veins and the quiet dignity of your character form a fortress that they can never breach. If you are standing right now in the middle of a dark room, surrounded by the bitter betrayal of your own blood, do not scream. Do not beg them for mercy. Do not offer them your tears. Stay completely silent. Gather the cold, hard weapons of the truth. Stand with your spine perfectly straight, lock your eyes forward, and march into the fire like a warrior. Thank you for listening to my story. Please smash the like button, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel to support us. Stay strong, and I will see you next time.